will be an interesting day. We'll see how it goes. I'm here for the duration. So, all right. So today's the first of our. So we've got 4 classes today: Wednesday, next Monday, next Wednesday. I'm going to send you an email, which I didn't get to this morning because there were other things going on. I didn't get a chance to write it. It just sort of lays out for you what's happening on various days and what's happening between now and when we're all done. So there's some stuff up here. You've got the problem set as you came in. The problem set to do next Wednesday, Thursday. It's your last official section. Then the essay, I'll explain all that in an email. That'll come out later today. Today we start monetary policy. So we've got 4 days when we look at the Fed and monetary policy and the determination of inflation and how the Fed fights inflation and how what the Fed does is determined and all of those good things. It can take about 3 days to tell the full story. And then on the 4th day, which is the Wednesday, December 3rd, what I've got planned for that day is to fold all of this stuff together and talk about the 2007-2009 crisis and all the wonderful details about that. So that's the plan. That's where we're going. All right. So you are aware, I'm sure, that there's protests going on. So I wanted to start just with a little picture that gave you some perspective on the UC funding. I also tweeted out some links and I'll put some in the email I'm going to put together so that you can look at various information about funding. This is just, I put together 2 pie charts this morning going from the UCOP documents that show the budget. And this shows the funding sources. On the left is 2003, on the right is 2013, and I popped out the tuition and fees and the state funding. So if you look at this, there's grants and contracts. It's about a third. So that's money that the faculty get for doing research. So it's NSF grants, NIH grants, that kind of thing. They come to us, and those are the monies that are used to hire people and pay them for RA ships and that kind of thing. There's the medical centers in the Department of Energy lab. So the Lawrence Berkeley lab up on the hill and Lawrence Livermore lab out in Livermore. The DOE funding and the DOE expenses of those labs are pretty much a wash. So that's pretty much the revenue we get and what's spent at the 2 labs is about the same. So I netted those things out. It's a very, very small contribution. Then there's the medical center. So UCSF Medical Center, UCLA Medical Center, UC Davis has a medical center. I forget who else does. So they take in lots of revenue because they see patients and so on. They take in lots of revenue. And so again, here I netted out the expenses of running the medical center. So we make a profit. This profit is off of the medical centers, not the Department of Energy. Gifts or philanthropy. So that's, they're hitting up your parents every month to ask them to give to the university. They're going to hit you up every month once you graduate. They ask you to give to the university. It'll never stop. So it's really awkward when you get to be a certain point because what's going to happen, you guys will, some of you are doing this now, just to warn you, at some point in your life, you will start getting phone calls from current students who will be calling you and asking you to give money to the university. They do that because it makes it much harder for us to say no. So anyway, that's a gift. So 7 to 10%. And then here in 2003, tuition fees made up 11% of the total. This is for the University of California system as a whole. So it's not just Berkeley, it's the whole system. And state funding was 32%. That number is a little bigger than the one that's usually quoted because I had here the net for the med centers and the DOE. So this isn't gross revenues. I also did a pie chart with gross revenues, but it's going to tell the same story. What's happened in the meantime is right there. So the state funding has gone from 32% of the total to 17% of the total. That's a result of the kinds of things we talked about. So we talked about state budgets and states have to balance their budgets and the reduction in state revenue and how the reduction in state revenue leads governments to cut back on spending. All those kinds of things. I'll fill in more of the detail of some of that later, but you get this big decrease in the state support for the University of California. And so you add these 2 pieces together, 43%, add these 2 pieces together, 40%. So basically what's happened is there's been a swap between state funding. So the state, which is to say all of the taxpayers of the state are contributing less and expecting a handful of taxpayers, that would be the parents of current students, both in California and from out of state, to contribute more. So that's kind of I want to give you that framework for seeing what this is about in that bigger sort of setting. There's a lot more that we could say. I started a clicker question that looked like this. And I started with what concepts that we've discussed in class are relevant to the debate about UC funding. And so, you only have A, B, C, D, and E. And so I started obviously with externalities because that had been one of your problem set questions. So think about externalities. Price discrimination by monopolists. We talked about that in class. Non-price rationing. That was also something that you've done on one of the problem sets. Production possibilities frontier. So the notion of trade-offs. If you have more of one thing, you have less of another, unless you have an increase in resources. Income distribution that we talked about. But then I couldn't stop just at E. I kept going because we also talked about labor markets, right? And so part of this discussion is about labor markets and the market for particular types of labor, people like me. Part of it, long-run economic growth. And so we had talked about the factors that contribute to long-run economic growth. And one of those is education. And so the higher the education level of the population, the faster is long-run economic growth. We talked about state budget deficits just last week, I think, or the week before. The thing I just mentioned about how states have to balance their budget, so in downturns, pretty dire things happen. We talked about about the effect of consumer credit availability and how the availability of consumer credit has an influence on how much people spend, and that's going to be relevant to student loans and accumulation of debt for student debt. So the easier it is, not just the cheaper, that's the interest rate, but the greater the availability through addressing the asymmetric information problems in the markets for student debt, the greater the availability of credit for student loans, the more student loans are going to be taken out, the higher demand is going to be for any education. And the 2007-2009 downturn, which feeds into a bunch of these things, which I'll come back to and address next Wednesday. So I couldn't figure out how to actually make that into a clicker question because your clickers only go A through E, and I came up with A through K, and then of course I wanted to add at the bottom, oops, put my glasses on so I can see what I'm doing, in color. I wanted to add at the bottom L, all of the above, which is actually the correct answer here, but your clickers only go through E, and so I couldn't actually make it into a clicker question. So lots of things that we've done. You can engage in conversation with your classmates, with your colleagues, with your roommates, with your peers, and bring to bear in those discussions the things that we've talked about here, because lots and lots of topics that we've talked about bear directly on any debate about funding for the university. So don't think that what we do here is irrelevant to anything but the big important stuff of life, like monetary policy. All right, so what are we going to do today? Today we're going to talk about monetary policy. So what have we done? So far in macro, we've asked the question of what does unemployment depend upon? And what we found was that unemployment depends ultimately upon aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. Because aggregate demand determines how much output is produced determines how many jobs there are, how many people have jobs determines how many people don't have jobs. And so when we want to understand the determinants of unemployment, we look at aggregate demand. We're going to ask the question now, what about inflation? What determines the inflation rate? We haven't talked about inflation yet at all. We've talked about prices of particular goods in micro, but we haven't talked about what determines the overall trend in prices, such as the percentage change over time in the CPI. The answer to the question of what determines the inflation rate is the amount of output. That is real GDP. The amount of output that's being produced is what determines the inflation rate. We're going to take Wednesday and talk about why. For today, I want you to just sort of say, I wonder what that's going to be about. So I'll explain to you on Wednesday why output determines the amount of inflation. It's a concept called the Phillips curve, or if you had a different approach in your macro class in high school, the ASAD model, which I don't teach because it's bunk, also relates to the amount of output and inflation. But what do we get? We get this. Aggregate demand. Ooh. There we go. Aggregate demand determines the amount of output in the economy, which determines the amount of employment, which determines unemployment. We already had that. We've just spent the last 5 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it's been, going through that story. We're going to add one more piece with a computer that's like hiccuping badly. That's not good. And that is that the amount of employment, which is determined by GDP, also is going to determine the inflation rate. So most of the answer to what determines the inflation rate we've already done. Most of the answer to what determines the inflation rate is the amount of aggregate demand in the economy. Because aggregate demand determines how much output there is. That determines how many workers are hired. That has a lot to do with inflation. The next question is who fights inflation and how do they do it? Well, the who is the Fed. And so that's why we're going to start talking about monetary policy. How do they fight inflation? Primarily, they do so by changing interest rates. And we've talked about the impact of interest rates. In fact, you got to write about the impact of interest rates. We know that, for instance, when the Fed increases interest rates, that leads to a decrease in investment spending because some projects that would have been profitable at the old lower interest rates are now unprofitable at the new higher interest rates because they're projects for which the expected rate of return is no longer in excess of the interest rate. And so that's one reason that higher interest rates lower aggregate demand. And we also know that higher interest rates lower net exports because higher interest rates lead to movements of funds around the world. Higher interest rates in the U.S., more funds are going to flow into the United States as wealth holders both in the rest of the world and in the United States put their funds into United States-based assets. That's going to have an impact on exchange rates. That's going to affect imports and exports and lead to, I forget which direction I was going up or down, lead to a change in net exports. Both of those things, the change in investment and the change in net exports, are initial changes in aggregate demand, which kick off the multiplier process, leading to round after round after round of changes in output, changes in income, changes in spending, such that the total change in real GDP is bigger than the initial change in spending from the changes in investment and the changes in net exports. Oh, this should sound kind of familiar. You got to write about it last Wednesday. So the Fed, when they change interest rates, is changing aggregate demand, which is changing output, which is changing employment, which, as we'll explain more on Wednesday, is changing the inflation rate as well. If the Fed wants to fight inflation, if they say, oh, we got a problem, prices are going up 3.5% per year, and we don't want them to go up that fast, we only want prices to go up 2% per year. If the Fed wants to fight inflation, they're going to create more unemployment. They're going to undertake contractionary monetary policy, which lowers the amount of output in the economy, lowers the demand for labor, and for reasons that you'll see on Wednesday, lowers the inflation rate. When the Fed fights inflation, they fight inflation by increasing interest rates, knowing full well that that's going to create some unemployment. So what we get from my herky-jerky computer is this. Aggregate demand determines output, which we've seen. Output determines how much employment there is, how many people have jobs, which we've seen. The amount of employment determines how much unemployment there is, which we've seen. The amount of employment also determines inflation, which I'll explain on Wednesday. The Fed looks at the values of unemployment and the values of inflation, and in reaction to the values of unemployment and inflation, the Fed sets interest rates. So the Fed, when they decide whether interest rates are going to be high or low or someplace in between, they make that decision based on the health of the economy, which is measured by inflation and various measures about the labor market. There was an article in the Reader where it listed all the things that Janet Yellen is concerned about when she looks at the health of the labor market. And then, as you explained to us last Wednesday, those changes in interest rates feed back and affect aggregate demand. So the Fed looks at the values of unemployment and inflation, sets the interest rates in reaction to those values of unemployment and inflation, knowing full well that those changes in interest rates that they put into place as part of monetary policy will come right back around and change aggregate demand, kicking off multiplier effects, changing output, changing employment, changing unemployment and inflation. That's what we're going to spend the next 2.5 days explaining, and then on that fourth day is when we get to apply it all to 2007, 2009. So let's review just a little bit about the Fed. The Federal Reserve Board is 7 people. The chair is UCB Professor Janet Yellen. That's probably not a picture of Janet Yellen. You recognize that's Janet Yellen when she first started at the university in the 1980s. You may recognize her more as this person. That's Janet Yellen today, and she is chair of the Federal Reserve. We claim her in economics. We always say Janet Yellen's a professor of economics and Haas at the University of California. We lower our voices and get quieter on the and Haas part. So the Federal Open Market Committee, which we mentioned before, is the Federal Reserve Board, those 7 people, the chair, Janet Yellen, and the 6 other governors of the Federal Reserve Board, plus 5 of the Federal Reserve Bank presidents. Remember, that's always including the Federal Reserve Bank of New York president, plus 4 others on a 1-year rotating term. The Fed's mission, which is on their website, you can go and look at their mission statement on their website. The Fed's mission is what they call a dual mandate. Now, I think that's kind of funny because they always call it a dual mandate, but you'll notice there's 3 things up there. Right? You would think if it was a dual mandate, there'd be a list of 2. But there's a list of 3, yet they call it a dual mandate because one of the 3, the third one, long-term, moderate long-term interest rates, actually influences the other 2. So the Fed's mission is a dual mandate. Their mandate is to undertake policies that promote maximum employment. We do not want to have an unemployment problem. We want to be on the production possibilities frontier, and stable prices. Now, stable doesn't mean constant. Stable means prices increasing at a predictable rate one year over the next. Right now, the Fed's goal is about a 2% inflation rate. So stable prices is not 0% inflation. Stable prices means very predictable low rates of inflation. And the Federal Reserve, their goal is 2%. They have about a 2% inflation rate. So that's the dual mandate. So the dual mandate is the employment and the inflation piece, the same things that we saw on the previous slide. And keeping long-term interest rates, which are actually the interest rates that are relevant for investment spending, we'll come back to that, keeping those moderate, so not too high and not too low. Now, we've talked about already one type of policy. I couldn't get this to reveal one column at a time. Yeah, whatever. We've talked about fiscal policy, but I'll just put a little check there. So fiscal policy, we talked about a couple weeks ago. Fiscal policy is the Congress and the President making decisions about government spending, transfers, and taxes. There are two additional types of policy. One is monetary policy conducted by the Fed. That's changes in interest rate and the money supply. We're going to start talking about that today. In all of the textbooks, those are the two types of policy that are always discussed. One of the things that we became aware of in light of the 2007-2009 downturn is that we also need to be explicitly aware of what we call credit policy. So credit policy, it's not mentioned in the book that you bought. It's not mentioned actually in, I think, any principles book yet, but will be within the next 5 or 10 years. It is discussed in that last article in your reader, which is the speech by Christina Romer. That's an optional reading, particularly relevant for those of you trying to take 113 next semester. Credit policy comes from both the Fed and Congress. And credit policy refers to all of the regulations surrounding the availability of credit, so the ease with which we can get credit, whether we are consumers or businesses, and also the consequences of default. So one of the things I'll talk about next Wednesday when I talk about 2007 to 2009 was the severe consequences of default on if you didn't pay your mortgage, or even your second mortgage, or even your home equity line of credit, all things that I'll define next Wednesday. The severe consequences of default contributed to the big drop in consumption that contributed to the really greatness of the Great Recession that has made the economy in really, really bad shape. So there was an awareness coming out of 2007, 2009 that we need to have more explicit awareness of what we call credit policy, because the credit institutions that we have and the nature of those institutions actually have a lot to do with what happens in terms of aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus net exports. All right, we're going to focus today starting on monetary policy. The Fed's ability to change interest rates, which is a key part of monetary policy, and as you discussed last Wednesday, was relevant to changes in aggregate demand. The Fed's ability to change interest rates is related to the amount of money in the economy. So what we're going to start with is by talking about banks and money. Building blocks, building blocks. So here we go. Financial assets. Assets. Remember, assets are things that you own that have value. So an asset is something you own that has value. One asset is money. One of the assets that we own is money. And when we refer to money, we mean cash and coins and checking account balances. So cash or currency, those paper bills with presidents and other people's pictures on them. Coins, quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies, that kind of thing. And the balance in your checking account. Those are money. Those are assets. They're things that we own that have value. In the U.S. today, cash and coins are about 1.2 trillion. The balance in checking accounts or checking-like accounts is about 10 trillion. So the more than 90% of the money in the economy is actually held in checking accounts. And only about 10% of it is the stuff that's in your wallet, perhaps, right now. The advantage of holding your assets, your financial wealth, the advantage of holding your financial wealth in the form of money is that money is what we use to pay for things. If you go down to the grocery store and you want to pay for your groceries, if you talk to your landlord and you want to pay your rent, you need money. You can have cash, currency, you can have coins, or you can have a balance in your checking account. You can access that balance in your checking account by writing a check. You can access that balance in your checking account by using your ATM card. But those are assets that you can use to pay for things like groceries or your rent. The disadvantage to holding our wealth in the form of money is that money doesn't earn much interest, and in fact may earn zero interest. So it's pretty hard these days to find a checking account that pays interest. It's pretty hard. You might be able to find one, I don't know. But even, we've got a savings account at Bank of America, a really silly place to have a savings account, because the interest rate is 0.01%. It's like 1 penny per month in interest. Not a lot. So the disadvantage of holding our wealth in the form of money is it doesn't pay interest. It may not pay any interest. Then there's all the other financial assets. That includes stocks and bonds and retirement funds, all that kind of stuff. And that's about 85% of all financial assets. So about 85% of financial assets in the U.S. are these other things, stocks, bonds, what we have in our retirement accounts, and so on. About 15% of the financial assets are money. The advantage to holding our wealth in these other non-money financial assets is that those things earn interest. You put $1,000 into some stock fund or into some bond fund, you're going to have more than $1,000 in all likelihood at the end of the year. You put $1,000 into your checking account, you don't spend it, you're going to have $1,000 at the end of the year. So the advantage to putting your wealth into these other forms, stocks and bonds, retirement funds, is you'll have more wealth at the end of the year than you had at the beginning because they earn interest income. The disadvantage is you can't use those things to pay for your bills. So you can't go down to the grocery store with your stock account and say, I would like to pay for my groceries with 1 share of the stock in whatever company this is. Right? Like, get out of here. They don't want that. Your landlord, you can't go to your landlord and say, can I just give you a share of Apple stock for my rent? No, you can give me a check that my bank will honor. That would be perfectly fine. Thank you very much. If you would like to sell your share of Apple stock on the market and then use those funds to pay your rent, that's perfectly fine with your landlord, but your landlord wants a check. So the disadvantage to holding your wealth in the form of financial assets is you can't directly use those things to pay for goods and services. You've got to exchange them first for money. So you have to sell the stock or the bond or withdraw some funds from your retirement account and then use the resulting money to pay for goods and services. Okay, clicker question. What's money? Which of the following is not money? A, coins, B, credit cards, C, currency, D, checking accounts, or E, all of these are money. A, B, C, D, or E. 3 seconds. 1001, 1002. There's a bunch of muttering, which I'm not surprised by because you're split 2 to 1 between 2 of the answers. And stop. Credit cards. Credit cards are not money. 64%. Get my happy face. Money, previous slide, is an asset. An asset is something you own. A liability is something you owe to somebody else. When you charge on your credit card, right? You go down and use your credit card to buy, say, I don't know, tickets, $50 worth of tickets for something. That wasn't an asset that you used to buy those $50 worth of tickets. You just took out a loan from the Visa or the MasterCard company. You just incurred a liability in order to exchange that loan for $50 for the tickets.